This is Crime Dopers. I'm Wanja. I want to share a content warning. This story contains discussion of gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, and death. There will be no graphic descriptions, but the themes may still be heavy, especially for listeners who have experienced loss or abuse. Please take care of yourself and pause if you need to. Now, before we talk about suspects, before we talk about courtrooms, manhunts, and police files, we need to talk about time. Because time behaves differently when you're waiting for justice. For investigators, time is evidence. For journalists, it's deadlines. For the public, it's headlines that move on. But for families, time becomes something else entirely. Every sunrise is a reminder that the person you lost is still gone, and the person responsible is still free. In Kenya, we are used to waiting. We wait in traffic, we wait in hospitals, we wait in government offices, but waiting for justice, especially when a young woman is killed, has a different weight. It stretches days into months, months into years, and sometimes it stretches hope thin. This story begins in October 2024, but it doesn't stay there. It moves through police stations and court corridors, through media headlines and online outrage, through counties and borders, and at the center of it all is a 23-year-old woman named Seth Nyakio Njeri. You may have heard of her name before, maybe in a news report, maybe on social media, maybe during protest where people held candles and placards asking why women keep dying at the hands of people who once claimed to love them. But today we're not here to rush a story. We're here to slow it down, to understand what happened, what didn't happen, and what it tells us about the systems meant to protect us and the moments when they fail. Because this case isn't just about one crime. It's about how easily someone can disappear after taking a life, and how hard it is to make the country keep watching when the victim is a woman. This is a story about silence, about persistence, about a man who ran for over a year and a family that had no choice but to stay exactly where they were, waiting. And when police finally caught up with him, it wasn't in a dramatic chase. It was in a shop, on an ordinary day in a town where no one asked questions. This is the murder of Seth Nyakio. To understand this case, we need to understand where it happened. Because place shapes behavior, it shapes opportunity, and sometimes it shapes what gets ignored. Our story takes us to Thika, an industrial town just outside Nairobi, close enough to the capital to feel its pressure, but far enough to feel forgotten when things go wrong. Thika is a place of contrast. Factories run day and night. Universities bring people, young people from all over the country. Housing estates sit side by side, some gated, some barely holding together. For many students and young professionals, Thika is just temporary. You can come here to study, to hustle, to figure out your next move. And in October 2024, that was the rhythm of life. Students were wrapping up semesters, rent was due, jobs were uncertain, relationships, like everything else, were under strain. Seth Nyakio was part of that world. She was living her life quietly, moving between friends, family, and plans for the future. The place where she was found, Bafra Estate, isn't a headline-grabbing neighborhood. It's residential, tight-packed, familiar to anyone who's ever lived in a mid-sized Kenyan town. Bedsitters, apartments with thin walls, neighbors who hear things but don't always ask questions. And that detail matters because in places like this, privacy is close, but silence is closer. People mind their business, especially when it comes to couples, especially when arguments sound personal. In Kenya, there's an unspoken rule: domestic matters stay indoors. So when something goes wrong, it often goes unnoticed until it's too late. On the morning of October 14th, 2024, inside one of those apartments, something had already crossed the point of no return. There were no alarms, no immediate sirens, no dramatic scene spilling into the street. Just a closed door and a young woman who would never walk out again. This wasn't a crime scene that demanded attention right away. It became one after the fact. And by the time police arrived, the most important moments, the last minutes of Seth Nyakio's life were already gone. Which raises a question that will follow us through this story. How many warning signs are missed because the setting feels ordinary? Because the town is familiar, because the relationship is known, because the silence is normal. This is where the story begins. Not to the chase, not to the arrest, but to the town going about its day, unaware that a line had been crossed inside one quiet apartment. Now let us get to know who Seth Nyakio was. Seth Nyakio Njeri was 23 years old. That number matters because 23 is that in-between age. Old enough to be expected to have answers, young enough to still be figuring everything out. She was a graduate of Zetech University, one of thousands of young Kenyans who had done what they were told to do. Go to school, get a degree, try to make something of yourself. But graduation doesn't come with a manual. It doesn't tell you how to navigate relationships or independence or the pressure to succeed quickly, especially as a young woman. Seth was at that stage of life where you're learning through experience, sometimes painfully. To the people who knew her, Seth wasn't flashy. She didn't command rooms. She didn't live loudly online. She was described as quiet, warm, and reserved. The kind of person who listens more than she speaks, who doesn't always share what she's carrying, and that matters because there's a dangerous myth that victims of violence are always dramatic, always visible, always asking for help loudly. That wasn't Seth. She was navigating life privately like many young Kenyan women do, balancing expectations, trying to be strong, trying not to worry her family. Seth was also an only child. Her mother, Lucy Njeri, is a nominated MCA from Kirinyaga County. That detail brought attention to the case, but it doesn't define Seth's worth. What it does tell us is that Seth was someone's entire world. Every plan her mother had for the future included her, every hope, every imagined milestone, and when Seth died, it wasn't just a life that was lost. It was a lineage of dreams that ended abruptly. At 23, Seth was doing what many young women do, trusting people she cared about, believing relationships could be repaired, assuming familiarity meant safety. And this is where we need to be careful because too often when violence happens within relationships, the questions turn cruel. Why did she stay? Why did she go there? Why didn't she leave? But those questions miss the point. They place responsibility on the person harmed instead of the person who caused harm. Seth didn't die because she made the wrong choice. She died because someone chose violence. What makes Seth's story especially painful is how ordinary her life was. She wasn't running from danger. She wasn't living recklessly. She was doing what millions of Kenyans do every day, trying to live, love, and move forward. And now that we know who Seth was, we need to talk about what happened next. The discovery didn't happen in the middle of the night. There were no screams that drew a crowd, no flashing lights spilling into the streets. It happened quietly, inside an apartment in Thika, a place where people pass each other on staircases without even learning each other's names. At some point, on October 14th, 2024, Seth Nyakio Njeri was found dead. The apartment was familiar, not hers, but a friend's, a space that should have felt safe. Police were called. Officers arrived, and the room shifted from a living space to a crime scene. According to investigators, there were no signs of forced entry, no broken doors, no shattered windows, which immediately told police something important. Whoever had been with Seth didn't have to break in. They were likely invited or already known. An autopsy will later confirm that Seth died from manual strangulation. There were signs of a struggle. That detail matters because it tells us this wasn't sudden. It wasn't silent. It wasn't something she accepted without resistance. Seth fought for her life. And when it was over, the person responsible walked away, leaving behind a body. and a trail of questions. In the hours after Seth's body was discovered, investigators began doing what they always do first. They asked questions, simple ones, urgent ones. Who was the last person to see Seth alive? Why was she at this apartment? Who had access to her that day? And maybe the most important question of all, who had reason to hurt her? Because statistically and tragically, most women are killed by someone they know. So police didn't start by looking for a stranger. They looked inward. At Seth's circle, her relationships, her recent history, phones were checked, messages reviewed, timelines reconstructed, and very quickly, one name surfaced again and again. Kimanthi Gichunuku, an ex-boyfriend, someone familiar, someone connected, someone whose history investigators say raised immediate concern. And here's where things took a sharp turn. When police tried to locate him, he was already gone. No answer to calls, no response, no clear location, just absence. That absence changed everything because when a person disappears right after a violent death, it doesn't look like a coincidence, it looks like flight. Within hours, what had started as a homicide investigation became something else entirely. A search, a chase against time, and for Seth's family, for her friends, for a public just beginning to pay attention, the questions grew heavier. Was he running? Was he being helped? Would he ever be found? And perhaps the most unsettling question, if this happened so quietly in such a familiar place, how easily could it have been missed? Because truth is, if Seth hadn't been found when she was, the story might have unfolded very differently. And as the hours turned into days, one thing became clear. The answers were no longer in that apartment. They were out there, moving, hiding, and staying just ahead of the law. When detectives realized that Kimanthi was no longer reachable, the investigation crossed the line. This was no longer about what happened to Seth Nyakio. It became where he went and how quickly. Police began retracing his last known movements, checking phone records, speaking to contacts, following up on addresses tied to his name. But every lead went cold. Rooms were empty, phones were off, people claimed they hadn't seen him. And in Kenya, that kind of disappearance is easier than most people realize because once someone decides to move, especially across counties, they can blend into the background almost immediately. No national manhunt alert systems, no unified tracking databases, just overstretched officers trying to keep up. In the days after Seth's death, what investigators were facing wasn't just a missing suspect, it was a moving target. According to police briefings released later, Gichunuku didn't stay in one place for long. He shifted between counties, from Kiambu to Nairobi, then further out to Meru and Tharaka Nithi, urban centers, rural spaces, places where anonymity is easy and questions are few. Each move made tracking harder, each delay widened the gap, and as weeks turned into months, one uncomfortable reality set in. The longer he stayed free, the harder it will be to bring him back. Meanwhile, Seth's family was living in a different kind of motion, not moving counties, not changing names, but waking up every day to the same unanswered questions. Where is he? Why hasn't he been caught? And does anyone really understand what this waiting feels like? Because a manhunt isn't just a police operation. It's a test of patience, of resources, of public trust. And that trust was being stretched thin. As the search dragged on, Seth Nyakio's case began to surface beyond police files. Local media reported on the delays. Social media amplified the story, and slowly, public attention began to grow. Her name appeared alongside others, women whose deaths had followed a familiar pattern. Known suspect, clear warning signs, slow justice. Candlelight vigils were held, placards were raised. People weren't just asking for an arrest. They were asking what it will take for women's lives to matter before they were lost. Police maintained that the investigation was active, that resources were being deployed, that the suspect will be found. But as the manhunt stretched past 6 months, then 9, then a full year, the questions only got louder. Was he being protected? Was the system overwhelmed? Or was this just another case falling through the cracks? What no one knew at the time was that while the country was watching, Kimanthi Gichunuku wasn't hiding in isolation. He was working, earning, living an ordinary life. And that detail will come to haunt this case later, because when the arrest finally happened, it will raise a chilling realization. Sometimes the most effective hiding place is normalcy. And after more than a year on the run, after 14 months of unanswered questions, the manhunt would finally end. But not where anyone expected, and that moment changes everything. On December 13th, 2025, detectives moved in on Busia, a border known for trade, transit, and constant motion. Busia is the kind of place where faces change daily, where questions aren't always asked, where blending in is easy if you look ordinary enough. And that's exactly what he was doing. Kimanthi was working at a cereal distribution shop. Not hiding in a forest, not sleeping in abandoned buildings, clocking in, earning a living, existing in plain sight. When officers approached him, there was no dramatic chase, no resistance reported, no public scene, just a quiet arrest that brought a 14-month manhunt to an end. For investigators, it was the moment when the search finally stopped. For Seth Nyakio's family, it was something else entirely. Relief mixed with anger. Because while they had been frozen in grief, the man accused of killing their daughter had been moving forward. News of the arrest spread quickly. Headlines followed. Messages poured in, and once again, Seth Nyakio's name filled timelines and conversations. But this time, there was a shift, because this wasn't just about finding him anymore. It's about what happens next. 2 days later, December 15th, 2025, Kimanthi will stand before the court. And the case, after more than a year of running, will finally enter the slow, deliberate machinery of justice. But an arrest doesn't equal closure. It's just the end of the chase and the beginning of a much harder fight. As of 2026, the case of Seth Nyakio Njeri has moved out of the shadows and into the justice system. But it's important to be clear about what that means and what it doesn't. Kimanthi, the prime suspect in Seth's murder, was arrested in December 2025 after more than a year on the run. 2 days later, he was presented before the court and ordered to be detained for 21 days to allow investigators time to complete processing and prepare for formal arraignment. That detention period was not a verdict. It was a procedural step, a necessary pause before legal processes could properly begin. As of this moment, the case is still before the courts. Investigations are ongoing, evidence is being reviewed, statements are being formalized, and like many homicide cases in Kenya, progress is steady but slow. That slowness is familiar. Court backlogs, limited forensic resources, procedural safeguards that protect rights but also stretches timelines. Justice here doesn't move quickly, it moves carefully. Let us get to what has happened. The prime suspect is in custody. The manhunt is over. The case has entered the judicial phase. And what hasn't happened? There is no conviction yet. There is no final ruling. There is no closure for the family. And that distinction matters because in true crime, arrests often feel like endings, but in real life, they're just the beginning of another wait. Now, where this case stands now is a reminder of something crucial. Justice is not about catching someone, it's about following through, about ensuring due process without allowing delay to become denial, about making sure that once the spotlight fades, the work continues, because the true test of a system isn't how loudly it responds to outrage, it's how faithfully it works after the noise dies down. Seth Nyakio's story is still being written in courtrooms and files, and until that story reaches its conclusion, one question remains open. Will the end of the manhunt be followed by accountability, or will justice once again take longer than a life ever should? When we tell stories like this, there's a temptation to end with certainty, an arrest, a court appearance, a sense that balance has been restored. But real life doesn't give us neat endings. And Seth Nyakio's story reminds us of that. Because even now, with the suspect in custody, nothing about this feels finished. Seth was 23 years old. And that number should haunt us because it represents a life cut short not by accident, not by chance, but by a choice someone else made. A choice rooted in control, in entitlement, in violence that too often hides behind familiarity. This case forced a national conversation about femicide, about intimate partner violence, about how many warning signs we miss because they don't look dramatic enough. A threat dismissed as anger, a relationship framed as complicated, a conflict kept private because it's not our place. But silence has a cost, and in this case, that cost was a life. There's also something deeply unsettling about how long it took to find the man accused of killing Seth. 14 months. 14 months of movement, of ordinary days, of a man blending into the background while a family lived inside a single moment of loss. That contrast matters because it asks us to sit with an uncomfortable truth. Justice delayed doesn't just hurt families, it teaches offenders that time is on their side. But this story is not just about failure, it's about persistence, about a family that refused to let Seth's name disappear, about public voices that kept asking questions, about pressure that demanded attention long after the headlines faded. And that persistence is powerful because systems change, not when stories are told once, but when they're remembered. As this case continues through the courts, we owe Seth Nyakio something. Not speculation, not outrage, but attention. Careful attention, informed attention, the kind that doesn't look away when the process becomes slow or uncomfortable. Because justice doesn't need noise forever, it needs witnesses. Seth Nyakio was not just a victim. She was a daughter, a graduate, a young woman trying to live. And the most respectful thing we can do now is to refuse to let a story be reduced to a statistic or a moment that passes. So we keep asking questions, we keep watching, and we keep saying her name. This has been Crime Dopers. I'm Anja. If you or someone you know is experiencing violence or feels unsafe, please reach out to a local support service. You're not alone and your story matters. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and don't let silence do the talking.